The cities in Jesus' time hide details that go unnoticed in biblical reading. You probably imagine how houses were built or how streets worked. But the archaeological reality goes far beyond architecture. Leaving home after sunset in ancient Judea was practically suicide. There was no police, there was no light, and the city gates locked you out. The life of Jesus and his disciples was a survival movie. And it's this fascinating and dangerous routine and the wonders of Jesus' world that we're going to explore today. If a camera could fly over Nazareth or Capernaum in the year 30, the first shock would be the color. Everything was monochromatic, a dusty brown of rough stones and mud bricks that camouflaged the houses against the dry hills. Forget the white marble avenues of epic films. The reality of the cities where Jesus walked was a sensory assault of dust, smoke, and claustrophobia. Descending to street level, the feeling of confinement would be immediate, because what we call streets were actually irregular dirt alleys that rarely exceeded 6 feet in width. There were no sidewalks to separate people from traffic, so a simple walk to the market was a physical dispute for space between pedestrians, loaded pack donkeys, and the sewage that often ran through the center of the path. This chaotic layout wasn't accidental, it was defensive. Houses functioned as small fortresses with thick walls and no windows facing the alley, turning their backs to the outside world because the street was seen as a place of danger and theft. Life happened on the inside, in the courtyards, but this quest for security created a curious sound paradox. Since the structures were glued to each other to save material and maintain structural integrity, acoustic insulation simply didn't exist. In a village from that era, silence was a luxury no one could afford. The community functioned as a single living organism where thin walls meant you heard your neighbor's argument, the babies crying, and the grain grinding in the house next door. Privacy was a futuristic fantasy. Life was lived under the constant auditory surveillance of the clan, where everyone knew exactly what you were doing. And there was a rigid survival hierarchy in those alleys. If the silhouette of a Roman soldier or a tax collector on horseback appeared blocking the light, the local resident knew the protocol instantly. You needed to squeeze yourself against the dirty mud wall and lower your eyes. In those streets where the only law was force, physical space belonged to whoever held the sword, and the rest of the population needed to literally shrink to survive. When you entered a common house in Galilee in the year 30, the thermal and olfactory shock was immediate. Your eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the darkness, but your nose warned you first. The air was hot, humid, and had a strong smell of straw mixed with fresh manure. We expect to find a living room, but what existed was a biological heating system. The architecture of these dwellings didn't prioritize comfort, but survival against the desert night's cold. Without electricity or modern heaters, the solution was to bring the most efficient heat source inside: the livestock. The entrance floor was packed dirt, and goats, sheep, and even a donkey slept there. It may seem strange today, but sleeping while hearing the heavy breathing of a 100-pound animal by your side wasn't a sign of extreme poverty. It was the rule for most families. The animal's body heat rose and warmed the raised stone platform where humans slept, ate, and lived. Right on the edge of this platform, separating the people's area from the animal's area, were cavities made in the stone or wooden boxes for the animal's food. The name of this trough was manger. This completely changes the classic Christmas scene we know. When we read that there was no room at the inn and the baby was placed in a manger, it doesn't mean they were expelled to an isolated barn in the middle of the field. They were probably in the main room of a relative's house, which was already overcrowded, forcing the family to settle in the lower part, together with the residents' animals. But if winter demanded this hot and stinky squeeze, summer brought the opposite problem. When the day's heat transformed that stone box into an unbearable oven, domestic life migrated upward. The flat roof, made of branches and packed clay, became the main bedroom. It was the only place where one could escape the ammonia smell from below and feel some breeze. The ancient house was a survival machine, where space was disputed inch by inch. But if the lack of privacy within four walls already seems bad, the real social judgment happened on the outside, in the only place where water sprouted from the ground. Today, when we feel thirsty, we just turn a faucet, and water appears clean and effortless. But in first-century Judea, getting a simple glass of water was the hardest and most politically dangerous work of the day. The family's survival depended entirely on the women's physical strength, who needed to walk to the village fountain, often distant, balancing clay jars that, when full, weighed more than 40 pounds. Imagine carrying a microwave on your shoulder under the strong sun every single day. But the physical weight wasn't the biggest problem. The real challenge was the social weight. The city well functioned as antiquity's social network. It was there, in the early morning hours or late afternoon, that news circulated, marriages were arranged, and reputations were destroyed. That space around the water was a true open-air tribunal, where a woman's absence could be as condemning as her presence. If you wanted to know who was in disgrace with the community, you just had to observe the sundial. Respectable women went to fetch water in groups during the cool hours of the day. Going to the well at noon, under the scorching sun, wasn't a choice of preference, but a clear sign of social exclusion. That's why the biblical account of the Samaritan woman going to fetch water at the 6th hour, meaning at noon, says much more about shame than about thirst. She preferred to face the unbearable heat than face the judgmental looks of her neighbors. And that water, so difficult to obtain, had a curious use. The obsession of the Pharisees and religious leaders wasn't with bacteriological hygiene, a concept that didn't even exist, but with ritual purity. Washing hands before eating or taking ritual baths in pools called mikvahs didn't serve to kill germs, but to remove spiritual contamination from having touched something or someone considered impure. You could be physically dirty with soil, but if you had fulfilled the ritual with water, you were considered clean before God. Water controlled life, hierarchy, and religion. But while life in these Jewish villages revolved around tradition and the well, a few miles away, a giant and modern shadow rose, bringing a visual shock that most people don't even imagine Jesus witnessed. The classic image we have of Jesus is of a carpenter living in a peaceful village isolated from the world. But geography tells a very different and visually shocking story. Nazareth wasn't a deserted island. Just 4 miles away, less than an hour's walk, rose something that seemed to have landed from another planet. The city of Sepphoris. While Nazareth was made of clay and silence, Sepphoris was a vibrant metropolis with 30,000 inhabitants, known as the Jewel of Galilee. Imagine the daily contrast. If you were a young builder, or tekton in Greek, like Jesus and Joseph, you probably walked there to work. You left a conservative village where everyone wore raw wool, and, upon crossing the neighboring city's gate, were bombarded by streets paved with marble, open-air theaters, and colorful mosaics on the ground. For a first-century Jew, entering Sepphoris was an assault on the senses and morals. The cultural shock was brutal. While in villages, the law prohibited images of humans or animals by considering them idolatry. In the Roman city, you saw statues of pagan gods on every corner. While modesty was the rule at home, in the neighboring city's gymnasium, men practiced sports completely naked, something abominable to local tradition. This scenario changes how we view the gospel environment. Galilee wasn't just a rural setting of sheep and shepherds. It was a cultural battlefield. The urban setting seduced the young with luxury, hot baths, and entertainment, while the villages fought to maintain their father's tradition. It was at this tension point, between the simplicity of faith and the arrogance of empire, that the Christian message was born. But if cities offered moral dangers to the soul, the space between them offered lethal physical dangers to the body. Because the moment you set foot on the road to travel from one city to another, Roman law protection disappeared, and you entered a territory where geography conspired to kill you. Today, traveling 20 miles is something we do in half an hour by car, listening to music with air conditioning. But in the 1st century, that same distance represented a 2-day journey that required military planning. Leaving the city gates wasn't an act of tourism, it was an act of extreme courage, because the road was lawless land. The most famous and feared route of the time, which connected Jerusalem to Jericho, was known as the Road of Blood. Geography there conspired against the traveler. The road descended almost 3,000 feet in altitude in a short stretch, winding through limestone gorges full of natural caves. For a bandit or political rebel, it was the perfect office. He could observe the victim for miles, attack on a blind curve, and disappear into the caves before any help arrived. Because of this real risk of death, the concept of traveling alone, as we do today, was suicide. Nobody took the road without company. People formed giant caravans, grouping entire families and neighboring villages to create volume and intimidate robbers. This explains a curious detail from the Bible that many find strange. How did Joseph and Mary lose Jesus at 12 years old in Jerusalem? They weren't negligent parents. They traveled in a group so large and chaotic that it was perfectly normal to assume the son was with cousins or uncles in the front or back of the group. Besides the fear of being stabbed by a Sepphoris, there was the logistical challenge of purity. There were no reliable roadside restaurants. A devout Jew couldn't simply eat at a stranger's house by the roadside because he didn't know if the food was kosher or if the utensils were pure. So, each traveler needed to carry the extra weight of their own survival: bread, olive oil, dried fish, and wine on their backs, turning the pilgrimage into a physical endurance test under the desert sun. If you like discovering how real life was in these ancient times, comment now. History comes alive, so we can continue bringing this type of content. Roman roads connected the empire, but outside the guarded main routes, terror dominated. However, if the road was the place of fear, the final destination of most of these journeys was the place of shock. Upon arriving in the capital, the pilgrim found a city that should be the house of peace, but functioned as a bloody industry. Upon crossing Jerusalem's walls during Passover, the expectation of finding a sanctuary of silence and prayer disappeared in the first minute. What received the traveler wasn't spiritual peace, but an olfactory attack that mixed the greasy smell of roasted meat with the unmistakable metallic odor of fresh blood. God's house functioned, in practice, as a massive slaughter industry. The logistics necessary to sacrifice thousands of lambs in a single day transformed the temple into something we would recognize today more as an industrial slaughterhouse than as a church. Priests worked barefoot on the slippery stone floor, with stained garments, in a frantic rhythm of cuts and offerings. There was even a specific hydraulic engineering system for this. Drainage channels carried the excess blood out of the complex. staining the stream in the Kidron Valley red. The perfume of the holy city was, ironically, the smell of death. But if the nose suffered with the slaughter, the ears suffered with commerce. The court of the Gentiles, the outermost area of the temple, had nothing sacred about it. It was a noisy and aggressive bazaar that operated as the nation's central bank. Since Roman currency with Caesar's face was considered blasphemy and couldn't be used to pay the temple tax, money changers charged abusive rates to exchange it for the accepted currency. The Tyrian shekel, the sound of coins falling on tables mixed with the shouts of dove sellers and the bleating of sheep, creating a deafening cacophony. This explains Jesus' fury when he overturned the tables. He didn't interrupt a silent worship service. He stopped a corrupt stock exchange that exploited the faith of poor pilgrims who had traveled for days to be there. Besides commerce and blood, there was demographic chaos. During festivals, the city's population tripled. Inns filled up months before, and the solution for most was to sleep in the streets, on flat roofs, or in improvised camps around the walls. The holy city became a powder keg of sweaty, tired people exploited financially. Every city generates waste, but a city that sacrifices thousands of animals and receives crowds generates a specific type of residue that needs to be discarded. And the final destination of all that filth was a place so terrible and smoking that it ended up becoming the visual synonym for eternal damnation. Looking south from Jerusalem's walls, a column of black and greasy smoke constantly rose toward the sky, day and night. The smell coming from there was unbearable, a mixture of sulfur, burned garbage, and animal carcasses. This place wasn't a myth. It was a real geographical location called the Valley of Hinnom, or in Greek, Gehenna. For a first-century inhabitant, hell wasn't just an abstract concept of future suffering. It was the city's dump they could see and smell every day. It was there that the city discarded everything it considered worthless. Food scraps, rubble, and even the bodies of executed criminals who didn't deserve a dignified burial. The fire never went out because the garbage never stopped coming. When Jesus used the word Gehenna to describe damnation, he was using a powerful visual image that any peasant understood immediately. The place where life is discarded and consumed. But ancient cities didn't just discard physical waste. They also segregated what they considered human trash. Outside the gates, living in caves or improvised camps, were the lepers. The skin disease, which could be anything from psoriasis to modern leprosy, was a sentence of social death. By religious law, they were prohibited from entering the walled villages. The cruelty of isolation was audible. If a leper needed to walk near a road or saw someone approaching, he had the legal obligation to shout the word tameh, which means unclean. It was a human alarm to ensure nobody came close. The healthy population's greatest fear wasn't just bacteriological contagion, something they didn't understand well, but ritual contamination. In that society, touch was dangerous. Touching a leper, a corpse, or even a woman during her menstrual cycle made you spiritually radioactive. Whoever touched the impure became impure too, being prohibited from entering the temple or participating in community life until going through purification rituals. This created invisible walls between people, where compassion was halted by the fear of becoming an outcast. Jewish society lived under the crushing weight of these purity rules, trying to maintain holiness at any cost. But there was another weight, much more tangible and brutal, that crushed the pocket and dignity of every worker, coming directly from an empire that didn't care about purity, only about gold. If you walked through Capernaum's streets and looked into people's eyes, you'd notice a constant tension, a silent rage that hung in the air like static electricity. The reason for this wasn't just poverty, but the daily humiliation of living under a foreign occupation. Rome wasn't just a distant government. It was a heavy hand that entered your pocket and your dignity every day. Tax collection didn't happen once a year through a discrete bill. It was a physical and daily confrontation. Imagine being a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee. Before selling your fish, you needed to go through the local customs, where a publican, a Jew hired by Rome like Matthew, rummaged through your baskets. He had the power to decide right there how much of your hard work would be confiscated to pay for the emperor's luxury across the sea. But money was only part of the problem. There was a specific Roman law that generated visceral hatred in the streets. The law of the mile. Any Roman soldier, at any time, could stop a Jewish citizen in the middle of the road, throw his heavy baggage at his feet, and order, "Carry this." And by law, the civilian was obliged to carry that burden for a mile. About a mile and a half. It was the supreme humiliation. A family man could be treated like a beast of burden in front of his children, forced to serve the army that oppressed him. That's why, when Jesus said, "If someone forces you to walk 1 mile, go with him too," the crowd must have been shocked. He was suggesting retaking control of the situation through defiant generosity, in a context where forced submission was the norm. And where did all that money and sweat go? It didn't stay in the poor villages. It flowed to places like Caesarea Maritima, the seat of Roman government in the region, a stunning port city built with marble and advanced engineering, with hippodromes and temples dedicated to Caesar. For a Jewish peasant, seeing that opulence was physical proof of his own exploitation. Imperial architecture brought roads and aqueducts, but the price was the people's hunger. The city was a powder keg ready to explode in revolt at any moment. But while the day brought the tension of soldiers and taxes, sunset brought a different kind of fear, a primitive terror that we moderns have completely forgotten. For us moderns, night is just a change of scenery. We flip a switch and life continues. But if you were in Jerusalem or Nazareth in the 1st century, sunset didn't mark the end of the workday. It marked the beginning of an obligatory confinement by fear. When the last light disappeared on the horizon, the city didn't just darken, it died. The darkness of that era was absolute, something we rarely experience today with our light pollution. There was no public lighting, except perhaps for the occasional torches of a Roman patrol, which served more to intimidate than to illuminate. Inside houses, light was an expensive luxury. Clay lamps burned olive oil, the same oil used for cooking. Keeping a light on meant, literally, burning the family's food. That's why most people simply went to sleep as soon as it got dark. This darkness brought fatal logistical danger. Walled cities had an inflexible rule. Gates were locked at nightfall. If you were a late traveler and arrived 5 minutes after closing, there was no negotiation. You would sleep outside, leaning against the wall, completely vulnerable to bandits, wolves, and the desert cold. The wall was the only dividing line between civilization and wild chaos. Even for those inside the house, security was illusory. Today we think of thieves breaking down doors or breaking windows. But in those villages with simple constructions, criminals acted differently. The Greek term used at the time for thief often referred to someone who digs. That's because it was easier and quieter to dig a hole through the dry mud wall at the back of the house than to try to force the front door. The nightly terror was hearing the muffled sound of something scraping the wall while you tried to sleep. This changes how we understand biblical metaphors. When people spoke of light of the world or walk in the light, the message didn't sound just poetic or spiritual to the original listeners. It sounded like an urgent physical necessity. Light was the only guarantee that you wouldn't be attacked, robbed, or left outside the walls. But while the people feared the darkness of night, which always ended at dawn, a definitive shadow was forming on the political horizon. An iron and firestorm that would bring not just fear, but the total end of that world they knew. Those who walk today near the Wailing Wall see giant stones, some weighing hundreds of tons, fitted with a precision that defies even modern engineering. Looking at them, the feeling is of eternity. It seemed impossible that something so solid could fall, but that vibrant. Dirty and noisy world we've described so far had an expiration date. In the year 70 after Christ, the apocalypse arrived, not with angels and trumpets, but with Rome's iron legions. The tension that simmered in the streets under tax collection and military brutality finally exploded into an open revolt. The empire's response was total annihilation. General Titus besieged Jerusalem, cutting off the supply of those caravans that brought food. The city, which previously smelled of spices and animals, began to smell of death. Hunger reached such a desperate level that historical accounts describe scenes of cannibalism within the walls. The society that valued ritual purity so much ended up consuming itself in the filth of the siege. When the walls finally gave way, fire did the rest. The temple, that economic and religious center that seemed untouchable, was set ablaze. The heat was so intense that the gold from the decorations melted and ran into the cracks of the stones, causing Roman soldiers to dismantle the sanctuary block by block to loot the precious metal. It was the literal and terrifying fulfillment of the prediction that not one stone would be left upon another. There's physical proof of this moment that doesn't depend on faith. Just a shovel. If you dig the subsoil of the old city today, you'll find what specialists call the destruction layer. It's a black line of ashes, charred wood, and Roman arrowheads that marks exactly where that civilization stopped. The collapse of the stones led to the collapse of the elite. The Sadducees, that wealthy aristocracy that controlled the temple's commerce, disappeared from history overnight because their power base turned to smoke. Who survived were precisely the groups that didn't depend on the physical building. The Pharisees, who focused on studying the law in local synagogues, and the followers of the Way, the first Christians, who understood that the real temple wasn't made of rock. Walking there today is walking on the cemetery of a culture that tried to defy both heaven and empire at the same time. Herod's stones fell, but the ideas that were born in those narrow and dusty streets survived the fire. If you want to continue exploring the secrets of antiquity that traditional history doesn't tell, click here on the screen to watch our documentary about what real life was like before the flood. Click on the video on the screen to discover what it was like to live in a lost world.